to watch just before I left my office. I thought, uh-oh. So we're really glad that you made it. So I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, Director of Population, Environmental Security and Resilience here at the Wilson Center. And I think we're going to cover a range of very interesting topics as we look specifically at the continent. And some of the questions that we have posed are what separates some African countries from others and from much of the rest of the world? What can be done to increase voluntary family planning, and why do some women choose to use it while others do not? And what are the implications of Africa's growing population for the health, environment, economic growth, and political stability of the continent? So, not a small set of questions and not a small set of issues, and we really want to have, I think, what would be a very stimulating and engaging session looking at how these issues are connected. So welcome to our discussion. We have entitled it Africa's Stalled Fertility Transition, Causes, Cures, and Consequences. Let me redo that. It's actually Africa's Stalled Fertility Transition, Causes, Cures, and Consequences, because it's a question. There is a question mark at the end of that. And I think here we want to really focus on some of the questions around these set of issues and think about some possible answers and the implications to both policy and programs. And those of you who are fairly familiar with us here at the Wilson Center, you know that this is what we do. And very often we do this in partnership with others. We are here today as a result of a long-standing collaboration that we have with George Mason University in a series that we call Managing Our Planet. It's developed jointly by the Brazil Institute here at the center, together with the program I direct, our Environmental Change and Security Program, and George Mason University. And these series of discussions are based on the premise that the impacts of humanity and on the environment and human well-being are planetary in scale, and they're all linked. So we're looking at how these issues are connected. In a similar vein, many of you are familiar with our programs here at the Wilson Center that we do through the Environmental Change and Security Program. We've been doing this for 20 years now. Know that we look at how these issues are connected. And we are here thanks to our support from USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health for our HELPS program, which looks at the connections between health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security. So with that framing, I'd like to welcome in particular our speakers. It's great to have three outstanding speakers today, I think, covering a range of issues. And we're actually going to start with Jack Goldstone. And Jack, many of you may know him from speaking here at the Wilson Center, in addition to the work that he has produced, which has a long history and is very well respected. Jack, I feel quite privileged because Jack is spending some time with us here at the Wilson Center as a fellow. And at the same time, he's serving as a Hazel Professor of Public Policy and a Fellow at the Mercator Center of George Mason University. He's also quite busy. He's the director of the International Research Laboratory on Political Demography at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration in Moscow. So long title there, Jack. But we're delighted to have Jack here with us. In the time that he's with us at the Wilson Center, he's going to be looking at issues associated with the consequences of rapid aging in rich countries, runaway growth in Africa, urbanization, the growth of megacities, and the rise of a global middle class. So another small set of issues, Jack. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. I don't have a clicker. I'll have to punch that. Well, thank you all for finding your way here in this terrible weather. I'm going to start giving a broad overview of these issues. Some of you are familiar with some of the basic data, so forgive me if the introductory slides are nothing new for you, but we'll dig into some of the meat further on. Now, I've titled this, Why We Need Africa to Succeed, and why it might not, because there's a real public policy dimension. I think a lot of what is happening in Africa is going to be important for the world's future, but it's certainly not set in any way. Now, the current projections for the global labor force are that the labor force will decline almost everywhere in the world, sub-Saharan Africa being the great exception. Sub-Saharan Africa's young people are, in effect, the global labor force of the future. And whether they are productive, how large that cohort turns out to be, whether they find work or not, is going to have a bearing, I think, on all of us. Now, these projections, which go out all the way to 2100, are what-if projections. They're not predictions or forecasts. They are projections based on current rates of fertility and mortality for different regions in the world and what have been the trends in those changes in fertility and mortality. And right now, the reason that line for sub-Saharan Africa explodes upward is an unexpected stall in fertility. Fertility has remained high in most sub-Saharan African countries. It remains between 4 and 6 children per woman. This is resulting in the United Nations having to revise its projections. Here are a few for 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Populations of Nigeria, Uganda, and Niger, China for comparison. So these are the, for China, it's the working age population. You'll see, somewhat staggeringly, China's working age population is predicted to fall almost by half over the course of this century. That's the one-child policy kicking in and building momentum as smaller and smaller cohorts continue to have low fertility. But we have the opposite. In Africa, let me ask you to focus here on Nigeria 2050. Now, this is the United Nations low projection, this is their high, and this is the constant fertility projection. Now you say, why is high lower than constant? Well, even the high projection presumes a certain amount of fertility decline over the next couple of decades. But what's really striking is this range is still pretty tight. For 2050, population of Nigeria is going to more than double, even at the low estimate, and may go as far as to triple. And again, a lot of that is just baked in the very large number of young women entering childbearing age in the next few decades, and that fertility is still, for those cohorts, quite high. For Niger, the multiples are even higher. You're looking at a minimum of almost quadrupling in the next 40 years, possibly even higher, and by 2100, the numbers just, I think, are unimaginable. You know, you look at this projection here, 1 to 2 billion for Nigeria, and we say that's not going to happen. Something will happen first. But even to think of a Nigerian population of around 400 million raises questions of where is that population going to be? Are they going to be rural? Are they going to be urban? If they're urban, are they going to be in 10 cities of 10 million or more each? How is that going to develop? It's going to be quite striking. Now, the reason that these projections for sub-Saharan African population are so large is that fertility has been persistently high. For most countries in the developing world, fertility has rapidly come down. Brazil, below replacement already. India, below replacement already. A lot of countries, once the demographic transition began, and once fertility started to fall from 5 or 6 children down to 4, the decline generally continued and often accelerated. But Africa is proving to be a stubborn exception. For the last 15 years or so, many countries in sub-Saharan Africa have seen no decline in fertility. Most have seen only a very small decline, and a couple have even seen increases. Now, this has meant that the UN has had to radically change their projections. Between 2000 and 2012, the forecasts for most countries have had this kind of explosive change. This is Tanzania was expected to go from 40 to 80 million. Now the projection is to 140 million, and that's just by mid-century. Similar revisions for Nigeria, for Malawi, and these gaps that start to open up after 2030 are a consequence of earlier exaggerations or hoped for declines in fertility that haven't been observed. Now, this graph is a little hard for you to see, especially out there. What I've done here, I've taken the United Nations versus the demographic and health surveys. These are two common sources of data. The United Nations demographers work very hard to try and create projections for every country in the world. Every couple of years they do a revision, and they forecast in 5-year increments. Now, they do this partly from the They do this partly from the local demographic and health surveys, which provide the most accurate country-by-country data, but they also build into their projections additional data because the demographic and health surveys are not done for every country on a regular basis. Some countries get them more often than others, some are more thorough than others, and so the UN uses Bayesian techniques to try and judge from trends in a region what is likely to happen in individual countries. So they're doing the best they can. However, the result of this has been generally to overestimate fertility decline. And in fact, if we look at the very latest DHS estimates, which are here in green, this is the most detailed data. You can see for Senegal, it's very close. For Eritrea, it's very close. But here for Ethiopia, the UN estimate of fertility decline is a decline of more than 2 children per woman. But in fact, the DHS surveys show a little less than 1. For Mozambique, the UN has estimated that fertility declined by 3/4 of a child on average per woman. But the latest DHS survey actually shows that fertility has increased. And in fact, you'll see for many of these countries, the DHS survey data suggests even smaller declines in fertility than the UN has been using in their latest estimates. So my expectation is that when the UN issues its revised estimate next May, we'll see a further upward projection of population forecasts. So the situation in Africa is really quite stunning in terms of the continued growth of its population. It's very different from what's happening elsewhere in the world. Now, we've also heard a lot about Africa rising and growth of GDP, and it's true there's been strong economic growth in many African countries in recent years. However, on a per capita basis in constant dollars, it's often less impressive. For example, in Uganda, recent growth has been really strong, but again, that's recovering from a very low level in the 1980s, and in fact, real per capita income is only about 20% greater than it was in the late 1960s. Again, for Kenya, the last few years have looked very good, but again, they're just barely approaching the peak of 20 years ago. So Africa, we've had periods in African history that looked good for certain countries in terms of growth. What we're not seeing is a sustained increase in real per capita GDP. And that shows up in the calorie consumption. You see, for North African countries, there's been a fairly substantial move upward in kilocalories per capita per day. But for most of the major countries here, looking at East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, there's been no visible increase in food consumption per day. And the reason for that is most of the economic growth has been concentrated in 2 sectors: extractive industries and services, most of which are concentrated in the cities. And for the moment, even though urban populations are growing, 70% or so of the population in most African countries remains rural and is largely untouched by the increases in GDP that we've seen, which have been impressive, growth rates of 6, 7, 8% per year, but have not yet transformed rural life. Now, I have a couple of graphs here that are very messy and academic, but I am an academic, so this is what I'm going to do. I'll let my colleagues perhaps talk a little bit more generally about causes and consequences. But what I want to emphasize in this picture and the next, which look very much the same, This is an analysis that my colleagues, Russian Africanists and statisticians at the RENIPA Demography Lab have done, looking at causes of fertility change in developing countries and in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a model for UN classified developing countries excluding sub-Saharan Africa. And what this says is fertility is determined largely by what people say is their desired family size and the interval between children. The reason it works that way is when people are deciding, am I going to have a child this year, that affects the birth interval from when they had their last child. But as they get into their late 20s, early 30s, if they decide to stop, that is, okay, 2 children is enough, 4 children is enough, 6 children is enough, that's the desired family size. You can think of that as that's the stopping point. So how often people have children as they're going through their fertile years and when they decide to stop having children jointly determine the total fertility. Now you can see these factors for the non-African countries: desired family size, strong positive effect. The bigger the family you want, the higher fertility. Birth interval is negative. The bigger the birth intervals, the lower the eventual total fertility. And that's true for both Africa, same thing here as before. But if we say what factors are driving these proximate determinants of fertility, we find things are very different in Africa than elsewhere in the world. Based on the experience of Latin America and South Asia, it was common for development economists to simply say the best contraceptive is economic growth, and that increases in income and increases in urbanization, increases in employment, education, all of these things would have the effect of reducing fertility. And in fact, for the non-African regions, we see that. There's a direct impact from income to birth intervals. As people's income goes up, birth intervals get larger, and therefore fertility declines. And that's a pretty strong effect, 0.49. It's, on the 0 to 1 range, it's highly significant and is quite large. Now there's another pathway from urbanization. As income goes up, urbanization goes up, and this produces employment for women. This also increases the birth interval. This is women's employment in teen years. This is adult female employment. And we can see that when women start getting employed as teenagers, they stay employed as adults, and the birth interval goes up. There are also additional chains from infant mortality, education, but the large important ones are from women's employment and income. Now, if we look to Africa, we see that the impact of women's employment and income are not statistically significant at all. So something strange has happened here. These major drivers that we count on to stretch birth intervals are essentially not working at all. There's still a strong impact on women's education, so that higher income, higher education for women, longer birth intervals, that's still pretty strong. And desired family size, however, has a very strong impact on fertility. And in Africa, desired family size has remained exceptionally high. In fact, in many African countries, women are not having as many children as they say they would like. So what is going on in Africa that's unusual? Well, my colleagues and I have another paper on African culture in which we argue that Africa has traditionally had, instead of agriculture where men go out and plow and women stay at home and it's based around nuclear families, Africa has always had a very strong extended family structure. Women have done a lot of the economic work, both in hoe agriculture and in gathering, and so women have traditionally relied on the extended family to provide child care support. It actually does not only take a village to raise a child in Africa, but it's taken for granted by women that they have a village at their disposal. The extended kin obligations are widely recognized. So women in Africa can take a job. They can gain employment, and they can count on family, aunts, uncles, cousins, other household members to help with childcare. So getting a job doesn't mean you can't have children as often as before. And its desired family size remains large because your own economic welfare is not so negatively impacted. You don't bear all the costs of having and raising a child individually. A lot of that is socialized across the family. So the result of this is that even though income in Africa has risen, even though women's employment have risen, these pathways have not produced greater birth intervals and hence a fertility decline, and the desired family size has remained large, and that has kept fertility up. So, very briefly, what can we do about this situation? Because we've definitely seen that countries that accelerate their demographic transition tend to reap the benefits of demographic dividends with better educated workforce, higher investment per child, lower violence. Well, female education is critically important. Female education brings down both the real fertility and the desired number of children. So getting higher levels of education for women works on both of these pathways. More educated women tend to marry later, they're better informed about contraception, they generally have better access, and they tend to use family planning more often. We've done some projections, and it turns out that primary education is not a powerful factor for reducing fertility. In Africa, we've made great progress with primary education for men and women, but a woman who completes 6th grade is still likely to drop out of school thereafter, may still get married at 14 or 15, go to work at 16, start childbearing right away. Women who complete high school, on the other hand, are not likely to get married and start childbearing until they graduate around age 18 or 19. So that's already 2 or 3 years delay of childbearing. Now, in our projections, this is the median UN medium scenario for Tanzania at current levels of fertility. This red line is what we believe could be the new trajectory if secondary enrollment growth grew by 3% annually. Now, that's an ambitious target, but could be achieved. And if we could get 100% net secondary enrollment by 2020, we could really bend the curve. But either way, up until 2040, we're not going to see much difference. But there's a huge impact in the effect of secondary education that kicks in after about 2040 and makes all the difference in the world in the second half of the century. I'm about out of time there. I'll just leave you one last thought. In terms of the consequences of Africa's population growth, right now, many of the governments in Africa are rated as what experts on fragile states call weak governance institutions. That implies an inability to provide public services, including education and health care, also implies a weak ability to enforce law and order. So these countries are often the site of conflict, violence, frustrated youth. Now, right now, about 1.5 billion of the world's working age population lives in countries that are classified as fragile. This is based on a George Mason index that looks at 8 dimensions of fragility. But about almost 3 billion are living in stable countries. So the balance is almost 2 to 1. If nothing changes, the forecast population growth under the UN medium projections are for countries that today are serious or high fragility to gain almost 1 billion people in the next 30 years. Stable states will grow hardly at all. Now, as I mentioned, the interventions to change fertility will have very little effect before 2040. So this argues in order to avert the consequences of high population growth in Africa, we need a 2-pronged strategy. One is an effort to improve secondary education, especially for women. That should bend the curve of future population growth in the second half of this century and keep it manageable. But even over the next 30 years, we face a huge increase in the youth population and the young working age population in countries that currently have low quality of governance. So the second prong has to be trying to improve the quality of governance in the short term so countries can deliver the education and services to keep the youth cohorts that's already in the pipeline employed and, we hope, stably engaged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. So there's sort of three key points that jump out at me from your presentation. And the first is, I think I would label it what we sometimes say, demography is not destiny. So you sort of lay out the elements of these what-if projections, what are the assumptions, the overestimation of fertility decline according to the UN, and what that means. So a good set of evidence for us to really look at population projections and contextualize and analyze and not go on these as given. The second set of points, I think, is what you summed up in terming Africa as the stubborn exception to fertility decline, and sort of recognizing that fertility is determined by desired family size and birth interval between kids in many other parts of the world, but somehow it's a little bit different in the African context, looking at the proximate determinants and really zoning in on income and birth intervals and income and urbanization and women's employment, and really putting that in an African context. And that led for me to your third point, which is building on your point about the extended family network. You say many of the African women take it for granted that they will have this village available for them, but what can we do? And really providing two concrete solutions, focusing on secondary education for women and secondary enrollment growth, but recognizing that that will not have some of the immediate short-term impacts that we need to deal with some of the stability issues that can emerge. So recognizing that we need a two-pronged strategy that is both looking at education and improving the quality of governance. So thank you, it was great. So I think you provide a perfect opening for what Paul Lebec is going to talk about. Paul is currently serving as Senior Research Professor for African Studies at Johns Hopkins School of International Service. He's also Professor Emeritus in Sociology, Political Economy and Development Studies, and Director of the Global Information Internship Program and the Center for Global, International, and Regional Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And Paul is going to contextualize for us a little the revolt of Boko Haram and look at it in a little bit from a demographic lens. So, Paul?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here because I'm been working on Niger and Nigeria, northern Nigeria, and Boko Haram. And I remember, as I worked on it, Jack's 1991 prize-winning book, Population and Rebellion in the Early Modern World. And I went and thumbed through it. It is a perfect fit to explain Boko Haram. So I'm going to stroke him to some degree. But it's always nice to know that your work, good work, lasts and is enormously valuable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Nigeria, for those that aren't Nigeria hands. And this is the basic map of Nigeria. I have a whole set of issues to look at here. But I'm really looking at the Sahel, and it's larger, because this is really the region in northern Nigeria where Boko Haram is recruiting from. So Nigeria matters, and Jack provided a lot of really excellent demographic data that I won't have to reproduce, is that the population increase is astonishing in Nigeria. You have 178 million people estimated now. Nigeria really matters to the world economy for energy exports, and it is one of the few countries in Africa that has a large internal market with the capacity for deep industrialization, and it now has the wealthiest African, Aliko Dangote, who was here in the Leadership Summit this summer, who's now investing in deep industrialization and refining and integrated agricultural industry. It is an important political security interest for the U.S., and its growth rate averages over 7%, especially in southern Nigeria. It has a democratic system, at least an electoral event regularly, and its scale is very significant, and if it breaks up, it'll be chaos, right? So we all have an investment in securing Nigeria. So this gives you a map of the political outcome of the last election in 2011. These are the states here, mirroring perfectly these states all voted for Muhammad Buhari, former general, Northern Muslim, and these are the states that introduced Sharia criminal law between 2000 and 2003. This is a middle belt part of the country that's mixed Christian and Muslim. This is the old northern region of Nigeria. That's about 2/3 or maybe 2/3 Muslim and 1/3 Christian. This is the more dynamic center here in Lagos, doing very well economically in the west. This is the oil exporting region here. So what I want to do is summarize what my argument is here. I'm arguing that the fertility increase, the lack of decline of fertility is essentially creating a demographic ecological crisis. It's not just the increase in people, it's the stress on the environment, because all of these people keep animals, goats, sheep, and cows. And there's very little governance to produce environmentally sustainable agriculture. So there's an enormous problem there. Then there's a generational revolt of young people in the north, in the northern Muslim areas, that are unable to participate, form families, and mass poverty among urban youths. Every 14 years, there's a new wave of Quranic students and school leavers going to cities. And this has really produced an enraged and fragile youth that have become recruits for Boko Haram. The North, the fragmentation, the other important variable here, this is drawing on Jack's work, is you have a fragmentation of the North's political elite. This was a region where the elites dominated their peasant and popular classes. There was great cohesion, religious cohesion, political cohesion that allowed them to exercise power. All of that has disappeared. You have the elites failing to cope with economic globalization since 1986. And then you have a emergence, to use Jack's language, of an enormous population of youths unable to be absorbed into the labor force, who become attracted to heterodox and extreme sects like Boko Haram, Muslim sects in this case, and they are globally linked and globally connected. You have the failure of political Sharia to make any difference after 2003, and this creates the space for a charismatic Salafist preacher to lead Boko Haram. And then you have, in the case of the governance by the state governors, very weak ability to deliver services, much of which was mentioned by Jack first. And finally, the behavior documented by domestic, Nigerian, and international human rights groups, the security forces, intervention and brutality has just continued to feed the support and recruits for Boko Haram. That's now in its 12th or 13th year, depending on how you calculate it. So here's a quick shot of the Sahel, of the region we're looking at. Now this is to discuss this region, this is an interesting graph from Malcolm Potts, the demographer at UC Berkeley. This is a projection of the population growth rate in the Sahel over time here, and it's correlated, he's got also the potential or expected rise in temperature. So this region is going to be under enormous ecological stress. You already have conflict between herders and sedentary agriculturalists that have nothing to do with Boko Haram, rustling of animals because of the lack of land, and grazing areas and travel for animals through agriculturalist land. So this is really a serious problem. There's another shot of an ecological crisis there. This is the shrinking of Lake Chad, right, from 63 to 2007. So a major set of studies have just come out. And so all of these conditions are creating an extremely environmentally and population-stressed population. Here's some slides on the growth of the Sharia states. These are an underestimate. I've taken a very conservative estimate to 2010. It's actually much higher. If you look at total fertility in Nigeria, and here the economic development argument does make sense because this is the most economically developed region here. It's half Muslim, but not Sharia followers, people that follow Sharia. In Lagos, the birth rate's about 3.5, but in the far north, you can see it's 7.3 and 7.2. So I checked on this border, so that what I just showed you is the border. If you look at the other side, Niger, I looked at the demographic and health survey for Niger, and it's higher, but it's effectively the same ethno-national groups on these borders here, and you have an even higher birth rate here. So there's no doubt that the population crisis is a policy issue, and it's extremely difficult to have leaders in Nigeria take it seriously or consider it. Here's some good data up here on the effect of education. You can see none to 5.3. Now here's what the future looks like, and it tells us where our policy investment should be. This is the girls 15 to 19 who have either given birth or expecting a child, right? It's even higher in Niger. I won't show you the slide, but in this whole area here in northern Nigeria, you have a population where girls almost never make it to secondary school. I'll show you the data for that. There's virtually no contraception. This represents the Sharia states, the 12 states I showed you on the map here. And this is after decades of investment by the Packard Foundation and the Gates Foundation. So the problem here is extremely difficult to deal with and needs to be bracketed as an object of concern. You have education levels. 76, 77% in 2008 had no education. A tiny number have secondary education. This is I came to the same conclusion as Jack did on the importance of secondary school, and we're looking at access to secondary school. The Northwest, it's extremely low, and in the Northeast. This is for adults 15 to 49, the numbers of completed secondary school. And of course, this leads to enormous poverty. This is living on $1 a day from the Nigerian Population Bureau. It's not the most reliable data, but it's difficult to get accurate data on this. And malnutrition is a major problem here. The Demographic and Health Survey provides material on that. This is the Northwest Zone. Over 50% are stunted, the children, and you have a severe malnutrition problem in this region. Now, what I want to do is now take a look at how this came about. It wasn't just demography. There was a set of political issues that are important and will have to be taken into consideration for any policy intervention. The shift occurs in 1999 where the Northerners give up control, the generals, to the Southerners, and they then they do two things. They are ineffective, have an ineffective capacity to respond to economic liberalization, and the private sector and privatization of the state sector in this period favors the South, and the affirmative action program, the so-called federal character of state employment, is stagnant and does not really absorb northern educated people. The collapse of political agreements on zoning is another problem for the political elites of the North. And the northern politicians are unable to really aggregate and become cohesive in the party. So it's a story of elite fragmentation and conflicts as different members of the northern political elite are co-opted by southern political leaders, which is a real shift from the previous pattern. And the governors, it's important, fail to manage urban local governments and youths. There's very little actual local government elections, local government services are non-existent, and there's nothing focused on the enormous numbers of impoverished youths that flow into the cities. And finally, the political and religious elites have a divide over, split publicly and privately over the implementation of Sharia criminal law in northern Nigeria. Briefly to go over that, you have this Sharia movement is part of a global revival of Islamic politics, and where you have a republic of virtue imagined in a truly utopian movement that Sharia will solve all their problems. It begins with a member of the political elite, that's really important, who's opposed to the Sufis, who are mystical. The movement is very much funded by petro funds from the Saudis and the Gulf. It creates a modern movement called Izala, and creates the expectation that there'll be an enormous improvement with political Sharia. And the failure of political Sharia by 2003 and 2005 creates the conditions for the rise of Boko Haram. You have the Izala splits after Gumi's death in 1992, and takfir means to condemn Muslims for not following someone's interpretation and declaring them apostates, which is punishable by death. And they have then the emergence of this charismatic Salafist Sheikh Muhammad Yusuf, who has many modern dimensions as well as extremely conservative. But he makes the case that Sharia has failed the majority, that he forms an alliance with the Borno governor, so the political elites in cahoots with him, and it allows him to set up an enclave of believers, a state within the state in Maiduguri, of at least 5,000 to 10,000 people with networks throughout northern Nigeria. And then he declares the Nigerian state, of course, un-Islamic, that Sharia cannot be ruled by state-appointed judges. The other important issue, he attacks modern Western educated people who are called the Yan Boko. Boko means deceptively inauthentic education in Hausa. And he attacks the behavior of Western educated Muslims who are fragmented and have no political response. He also mobilizes and provides microcredit for motorcycle drivers, sewing, elite members of the elite put their children in his schools, so the support is far greater than what we would have imagined. There are conflicts with the governor and the Nigerian police, and finally a rebellion by Muhammad Yusuf in 2009. He is assassinated while in police custody, and the assassination of all of his followers is recorded and put on Al Jazeera. And then all of the networks that he's created are downloading all of these images, and that's part of the use of this media to produce this movement. This is the story of how demography lies at the core of the movement and recruitment for Boko Haram. The cities are choking with 14 and 15 to 20-year-old young men who can never form families and are attracted to these people. The major topic I want to focus on is that this is not solution, a policy solution, cannot focus on unemployed youths. It has to raise the educational status of Nigerian girls, given the resistance to family planning. If you could keep northern Nigerian girls in school until they're 20, you would take 6 years off the fertility calendar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think in your presentation and ideas, it was good to see that you are building on some of the work that we know that Jack has done in the past. I think Jack had entitled his presentation, Why We Need Africa to Succeed. And I was thinking a little bit about that as you had finished, Jack, and I think Paul had provided some additional information for us to be thinking about that. I think you presented Nigeria in terms of our political, security, growth, industrial, economic interests, and sort of really representing that the scale that we have in Nigeria is significant. I think a very compelling case is looking at the lack of decline in fertility and how that is tied to ecological and social unrest and stresses. I think that's very important. And then taking it on to tie it to connections with the political issues, the elite fragmentation, and the ability of a movement to come in and capitalize on disenfranchised youth who are not engaged, a lack of management of youth in urban centers, what it means for the articulation of a failure of political Sharia, and how he's able to build on that in terms of alliances with other political elites. Interesting, I didn't know that Boko meant deceptively inauthentic education. Very interesting to sort of see that dimension of it. But once again, a very good framing for us of how demography is at the core of this movement and mobilization and what it means for us. So Jeff, they've set you up. So now we go on to our last speaker, a longtime friend and colleague, Jeff Jordan, who's the president and CEO of Population Reference Bureau, PRB. And prior to being at PRB, Jeff was vice president for international programs at the Catholic Medical Mission Board, and previously had worked at Population Resource Center and Futures Group Constella Futures. And Jeff is going to be covering population dynamics for the continent, a socio-economic change and health perspective, looking at the consequences and impacts. So Jeff?
Thanks, Roger Mark. I just want to be very clear that this is not like a sitcom. So in a sitcom, you get your cast of characters, drama develops, there's a lot of chaos, and then as you come to the end, it miraculously comes to resolution. I'm not bringing you resolution, and you have to go out into the storm afterwards. So I just want to be very clear up front that I'm not bringing you resolution. I also want to thank the institutions which sponsor this series, the Managing Our Planet series, so George Mason University, the Brazil Institute, the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center for this opportunity to participate. These institutions have been great partners, and it's an honor for PRB to have a chance to continue to work together in this type of work. I also want to quickly and must acknowledge the staff at PRB. I've been a fan of the organization since I was in graduate school, but I joined PRB literally 2 months ago, and the data and the work that's represented in this presentation certainly come from my colleagues at PRB and a set of ongoing projects and work within the organization. And to further go ahead and do a nice moment of PR for PRB. So I also have copies of a couple of things that these came from, including a population bulletin on achieving a demographic dividend, current work that we're doing right now on non-communicable diseases and risk factors among youth in Africa that's being sponsored by AstraZeneca, the demographic dividend work being sponsored by a combination of private donors and USAID, And finally, what should be recognizable to anyone who's done any population or demographic work around the world, and that is the World Population Data Sheet. This is the 2014 version. Hopefully you've downloaded it online, but we actually do have some paper copies. And some of this will be represented in what's going on here. Having heard from our two speakers before, from Drs. Goldstone and Lubick, again, I'm here to discuss and to frame the discussion around a subset of socioeconomic and health impacts that are the consequences of this fertility transition, thank you, or the stalled fertility transition. And these are by no means exhaustive, but they provide a glimpse at some of the very serious consequences of what we're dealing with here. So I'll divide my slides and comments into three sections. The first, some additional framing of population change from both global and regional perspectives. Then a brief discussion of the lost opportunity to benefit from the potential for a demographic dividend that we face where we have stalled fertility transitions. And finally, want to highlight the double burden that countries that have not achieved a fertility transition face due to the consequences of that high fertility wed to the growing incidence of non-communicable diseases globally, but even particularly within Africa. So again, I don't promise a pretty ending. It's for all of us here to help make that. This comes from a 2005 World Population Data Sheet and was one of the representations within the data sheet. And it projects population change, and this follows on a lot of what my colleagues have said before. What to note from this is this projects change over a 45-year period. The countries in the darker blue, which is mostly sub-Saharan Africa with a few in the Middle East, are countries that over the next 45 years will at least double in their population size. So at least double. Many of these countries show population growth rates that may triple, quadruple their population sizes over that time period. So we're talking about very, very serious change. And as has been noted, there's been some tremendous global declines in total fertility. I mean, total fertility in the 1950s was probably at a level of about 5 children per woman, and we are today well under 3. However, you know, the regional impacts are very, very different. And again, this follows on work and discussion that we've had. If you look in sub-Saharan Africa, there has been decline. I mean, we have to acknowledge that there has been decline, but not the declines that we've seen in the rest of the region, not the levels of the decline. And you can get into desired family size and all of those other reasons, but again, significant differences here. And as we all know, 2.1 is the total fertility rate that kind of accompanies a stabilization and within a population. But even if we were to immediately go to a 2.1 fertility level in sub-Saharan Africa or any of the regions, we know that the momentum of population growth would continue for years. So I want to just real quickly take this, and it's just very beneficial that we're all focusing on similar subsets of countries. But to look at just a comparison and, you know, what we'll call the demographic divide. I'll come to the dividend in a minute. And this takes 2 countries, one from Europe and one from sub-Saharan Africa, so the Netherlands and Niger, who currently have populations that are almost exactly the same. The population of Niger is just under 17 million, the population of the Netherlands also 16.8. But when you suddenly start getting into the differences, lifetime births per woman in Niger remains at we've seen slightly different numbers, but 7.6, 7.8, 7.9 children per woman over her lifetime. Very stubborn, very high, and in fact, these have slightly increased. Whereas what is typical in most of Europe, in much of the US and the developed world, a TFR well under replacement fertility in the Netherlands. But then you look at the time patterns and the changes that represents. And the main one being both everything from annual births, so populations of the same size having annual births in Niger at almost 1 million per year compared to less than 200,000. And when you look at those trends over time, then you get to a projected population in 2050 for Niger, and again, these are just based on medium projections, that has quadrupled, that has moved from 17 to 66 million people. Whereas in the Netherlands, that increase over the same 45-year period is about 1 million people. And so what we're dealing with in terms of those growth patterns, the impact that that has on age structure, not even the impact that it has, I mean the current age structures, as we said, and we'll get into those dependency ratios, where half the population in Niger is under the age of 15. And when you think about dependency, what that means for how many people you have in a working age population and what they have to do to support the youth within that, compared to a 1 in 6 level within the Netherlands. And then finally, just all of the health indicators that come along with that when you look at countries that have not gone through fertility change. And so you're still dealing with high infant mortality rates, high maternal mortality rates, all of those within. So to specifically come back to, again, this point to get into the dividend side of things, and that is looking at this population below the age of 15. So the next two slides come from the most recent data sheet, and really are the graphics that look at a comparison of the age structure in two regions. So I'm just going to compare Latin America and Africa. The filled-in region represents the population pyramid back in 1970. The darker lines are the population pyramid today. And the thing to note here for Latin America is it's very clear that Latin America has gone through a fertility transition over the last 40 years. The extreme difference in the relative size of the youth population, I've lost it. There it is, thank you. The relative size of the youth population and how much it has shrunk, and the relative increase in the size of the working age population greatly changes the dependency ratios, and therefore the amount of resources that are available either to invest in your children, to invest in the economy, to invest in other things. If we look at the same thing for Africa, the same set of graphs, unfortunately what we notice is very little change. I mean, there has been some change. The cohorts have slightly decreased, but not at a rate that we're talking about that has made significant change. You can look at country by country, and there are some country patterns that have had positive change. But again, unfortunately, what you don't have over here is enough change to start recognizing a dividend. And I won't spend much time on the demographic dividend. There's a tremendous amount of work that's going on right now, including our own, looking at the demographic dividend and what's positive. And for those who either don't recognize the term, but the basic concept here is that accelerated economic growth may result from a decline in a country's mortality and fertility rate and the subsequent change that creates in age structure. So with fewer births each year, a country's young dependent population grows smaller in relation to the working age population. So with fewer people to support, a country has a window of opportunity for rapid economic growth, assuming the right social and economic policies and governance policies are in place and investments are made for that benefit. And there's a lot of work that's been done on what that looks like in Latin America, what that looks like in Asia. However, if you're in a situation where you have stalled fertility transition, by definition, you've eliminated the possibility or hope to achieve a dividend, because the starting point of that assumes that you've had a population change and that your age structure has changed, so that your dependency ratios have changed. So on that hopeful note around the possibilities of the population dividend, I want to switch back to health. Again, for many of us who've worked for years in family planning, reproductive health, and in public health, and looking at change in primary health patterns, there's been great hope and great change. We see increasing life expectancies. We've seen falling total fertility rates. We've seen falling infant mortality rates. All of those have been very positive change on a global scale. And as such, there has been a transition globally, and that we have moved from an era where communicable diseases and others are the greatest factors and causes of death in the world, to one in which the world has longer lifespans, and that the causes of death are actually moved to being more important within the non-communicable disease world than they are among communicable diseases. Now again, that shift hasn't yet taken place in Africa, or hasn't fully taken place in Africa. And so globally, we've also shifted from not mortality issues being of great term, but to disability and morbidity issues being of concern, because when you're dealing with non-communicable diseases, and I'll come to kind of the four top, those have a greater impact on us as we hit the 45 plus range, when supposedly we're at the peak of our earning potential and other kinds of things. And so what kind of impacts that has on health systems, what kind of impact that has on other things. But the other important thing about these non-communicable diseases is that these are, the risk factors now become behavioral, and they are things that we can do and that we can impact and affect. The problem for countries that have not gone to a fertility transition right now is that they've got the double whammy. They are still dealing with high fertility, high infant mortality, high maternal mortality, and all of that from and the communicable diseases that often accompany that. But they are also have made a transition where their patterns look more Western in terms of the non-communicable diseases, and that incidence has risen steadily. The four major NCDs are the following: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory diseases, and cancers. And globally, NCDs now kill more people each year than all other causes combined, and that's globally. Cardiovascular disease, over 80% of cardiovascular disease and diabetes deaths, and almost 90% of deaths from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease occur in low and middle income countries. And more than 2/3 of all cancer deaths occur in low and middle income countries. The major thing to note, and that we need to again be talking about, is that the underlying risk factors that go in this are behavior linked, and there is actually something we can do about them. And those behavior links are tobacco use, alcohol use, insufficient physical activity, and an unhealthy diet. So again, coming back to lack of a transition and large youth populations, you know, there is a potential extra time bomb here waiting to go off. Two of these factors, tobacco and alcohol use, tend to begin during adolescence, and we're collecting data on what that looks like and some of the trends that are difficult in those. And the other two, if they're not already rooted in adolescence, become increasingly difficult to deal with in adult years, as all of us know, and that's physical activity and healthy diet. Look at the US, look at Western Europe in terms of what our own patterns are, and unfortunately, most of those have already been adopted within sub-Saharan Africa. So given the current large youth populations, well, guess what? They grow up and get older. If anybody didn't tell you that, I will let you know now that you do grow up and get old. You hopefully grow up and get older. But the populations of that age group are going to increase, are going to triple over the next 45 years. So a significant increase in the number of adults because you've had so many youth. But if we don't deal with it now, if we don't start dealing with some of those issues, where this starts to hit in terms of productivity, in terms of disability, in terms of health systems, gets increasingly large going forward. And that increase in NCDs is mostly due to increases in urbanization, aging population, globalization trends in eating patterns and inactivity and all types of things. And that actually by 2030, NCDs will be the leading cause of death even in sub-Saharan Africa. So let me show you just a couple of the patterns that are emerging within NCDs, and again, why we need to be looking at those as well. And I would argue that is in all countries, but not solely within sub-Saharan Africa. Research that we are doing right now under a grant with AstraZeneca we've been pulling data or attempting to pull data on use and risk factors among youth in Africa. This first slide is the top 10 countries in terms of the amount of tobacco use for boys 13 to 15. And so this is tobacco use in the last 30 days. And you see a range from a high of 34% to a low in this group of 24% in South Africa and a high in Madagascar. And you'll note within this pattern that the blue bars are actual cigarettes, but that there's a significant use of other tobacco products depending on the country that you're in. And again, the same kind of risk behavior. Among girls, interestingly, similarly high rates of tobacco use, and these are adolescents. Although what's interesting is sometimes you'll see data that girls in Africa have lower rates of smoking. Well, they do have lower rates of smoking, but unfortunately they have higher rates of other tobacco use. So it's still an issue, it's still a problem. And again, the added problem is that these are rates for 13 to 15-year-olds, and what all the data shows is that at the time they become older youth, these rates rise significantly. Nutrition. Again, a double burden in a lot of these countries. This data includes Egypt, so it's not just sub-Saharan Africa, but for the top 10 in Africa, in looking at a combination of girls who are overweight or obese and girls who are underweight or undernourished. And you get a dual burden in a lot of these countries, with a high in Egypt of 40% of the girls in the 15 to 19-year-old being either overweight or underweight, and coming down to Rwanda, where you're still at about a 25% rate. And then finally, alcohol use. We also have some on activity levels, but I'm not pulling that in right now. These are boys or girls who have had a drink in the last 30 days. And again, just one drink, but I mean, these are 13 to 15-year-olds. I don't know how many of you have 13 to 15-year-olds, but hopefully, well, we're all dealing with it. Anyway, rates as high as 39 to 45% in Zambia. As you get into states that tend to be more conservative from a religious standpoint, you tend to find lower levels. But again, alcohol use is doubly important, I think, for us because of related gender violence, all of those types of things that tend to play out when you have alcohol abuse. And if you're starting this at 13 to 15, where do those levels go by the time that they are 20 or higher? So again, why is it important to also look at NCDs within the context? So we're not just looking at fertility, and I don't want to diminish at all looking at fertility transition, family planning, reproductive health. Absolutely, I think the arguments have already been made there. But what I want to add to it is this, and that is that you've got a long-term issues of productivity loss, you've got long-term issues around lack of robust health systems that were being built to deal with communicable diseases and others, and that aren't equipped to deal with non-communicable diseases, and the related healthcare costs that come into this and the kind of investments that will take is just going to deter investments in education and in other sectors. So, again, as we look at all of these issues, really important things to say. So again, I've just come through and just wanted to reiterate that, as we've all talked about, global and regional differences in fertility rates and population change, the fact that if you do not start by achieving a fertility change, the likelihood that you're going to benefit and have a demographic dividend coming out of the other end, you've already blown that up front. And finally, that we've got to look at two types of disease burdens in these countries that have not had their fertility transition. And on that joyful note, I'll turn it back to Roger Mark.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. You lived up to your promise of no immediate resolution, but a lot of drama. So I think it was very good to see the comparison between Niger and the Netherlands. This point on the demographic divide, I think, was very compelling, and sort of linking that as we look at questions on the demographic dividend and recognizing that, comparing Latin America and the Caribbean to Africa, that there isn't enough change that allows us to capitalize on the dividend for Africa. Very compelling point throughout on what you call this double whammy, this double burden, not just on the youth population, the fertility side, but looking specifically at health and NCDs and patterns that have been adopted on the continent and elsewhere that are more Western patterns. And recognizing that a lot of these patterns are tied to behavior. I was actually quite struck to see the tobacco use among both boys and girls. That was compelling and eye-opening for me, but recognizing your point also about physical exercise and nutrition and alcohol use. And Jack, it made me think, Jack and I were just in Tokyo meeting with Japanese policymakers about the importance of looking at population aging. And I remember coming out of those conversations we had just last week, the Japanese officials were telling us, well, the issue that they're dealing with is their population is getting older, and this older population is healthier. And it's very healthy, so that's their question that they're having to deal with. So a completely different set of issues, but it's your presentation brought that point home for me again. So Jeff, I want to ask you a little bit, because you talked about health, Ebola. You know, it's emerging, it's dynamic, it's frightening. It is very much a threat and a shock. We're all concerned about it. How do you see this fitting in as you look at these aspects of fertility and demographics and this double burden, not necessarily tied to behavior, but additional stress for the continent? Any thoughts, reflections? How are you thinking about Ebola? How are you framing this?
Well, I mean, I think that actually in the context of everything that was said today, the Ebola crisis that's currently taking West Africa and taking any of what's happening in Europe and the U.S. out, because it's such a different context and it's just not even anything for us to be highly concerned about in terms of our own safety and our own protection within our health systems, is the interrelated set of consequences that play out here.
Mm-hmm.
You have everything from equitable access to health and to good health care. You have extreme economic stress that's starting to play out in the closing of borders and the inability of migratory workers to move in on the next cocoa crop. So for any of you who like chocolate or anything else, get ready for the prices to go up, because they are. We are an interconnected world and an interconnected set of societies, which is one of the reasons that you've seen this explosion in Ebola, because the pattern of that particular disease has normally been one that it's so virulent and so quick in its spread, but it was so isolated that as long as you didn't have great population movements, it was not a huge health crisis. We've seen that change. And when you get into political stability, when you get into labor and other kinds of things, I mean, looking at the factors of the major capitals in Africa mostly being ringed by slums. Mm-hmm. And if that's where the explosion is, because you have differential access to health, you have a differential ability to be able to address that. What does that mean for stability? What does that mean for service delivery, for any a host of other kinds of things? So I think it is going to have a serious and longer term effect, even if we turn this around in the next 2 months and give it the kind of attention that we probably should have had at the beginning. It's going to have a much longer term series of economic, political, and other consequences on what happens in West Africa.
Paul, I know you want to comment on that. Let me add a question to that, particularly for you.
Yeah.
You're looking at the connections of these issues. You also talk about the ecological stresses that lead to instability and how this leads to mobilization around these kind of movements that you were speaking of. And I wonder to what degree here at the Wilson Center, we do a lot of work on sustainability and resilience. And the whole aspect of resilience is developing a community or a nation's capacity to respond to long-term stresses and shocks. And these shocks may be tied to the environment, they may be tied to instability, they may be tied to Ebola, and these kinds of crises. How are you seeing this playing out for a country like Nigeria, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I have a wonderful story to talk about Ebola in Nigeria. Because it entered in Lagos, and you have probably the best organized state government there, mm-hmm. They limited the deaths to 7. Mm-hmm. They mobilized the population and did not inflict stigma on anyone, and used the internet. And there was another city, Port Harcourt, and after 21 days, it's been eradicated. Now And what I want to underscore is the importance of health infrastructures is so important. And this is the best health infrastructure in Nigeria, and it contained it. If it was elsewhere, it would have been, nope, they would have denied it, or who knows, or covered, or everybody would have departed. So that's a positive story, and the emphasis on healthcare. On the environmental stress, I think that if you had any doubt about global warming, the literature on Lake Chad will convince you. I mean, this is this is unbelievable, shrinking, and the potential for this population to all immigrate south is really the great risk. And so that one of the responses that people should consider is agroforestry in this region. Part of the reason why Lake Chad's disappearing and the degradation of the environment's occurring, because the removal of the vegetation raises the temperature, and then it's a cycle independent of global warming. So there's people working on this. Oxfam has a very successful program. There's trees. There's many things that could be done. So agroforestry and bringing women into goat production is one of the projects I'm working on. Because women actually keep goats in northern Nigeria as a hedge against the instability of the marital contract, which is high. Right? And the Fulani, the cattle rearers, don't like the goats. They prefer sheep, but goats are so much more productive, and you don't need a shepherd because goats are smart enough to come home.
So, Paul, I did want to follow up on you on. I thought you slipped in quite nicely in your presentation a slide from Malcolm that may be contentious in some circles. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate
Armageddon
Change
slide for Malcolm, yes.
has recognized more of these connections between environmental factors and conflict and instability. And I think Malcolm's slide, which you highlighted, talks about rising temperatures and the degree that to which that may lead to instability or conflict. And this is a very contentious area in this field. And I wondered whether you could comment on that. Is that something that you think is credible for us to be talking about rising temperatures leading to conflict?
Yeah, I'm nervous about this. Mother Jones had a whole article on it, and they kept interviewing me, and I'm saying, look, the global warming is part of the problem, but with a fertility rate like this, this is what explains the variance here. The other problem is that if you talk about external variables to the Nigerians, they will always choose an external cause rather than a domestic cause, as most people would. So it takes it away from the real problem, which I believe is the status of girls in northern Nigeria. You have to raise the educational and social status of girls, which will have enormous benefits. Jack provided the statistics on secondary education. I had come to the same conclusion empirically from field work. So that's really what people need to focus on, and to raise the status of girls and to support, in my case, I'm working with Muslim Sharia-compliant Islamic feminist groups that are working on healthcare. And there are large numbers of these people working on this.
Thank you. So, Jack, I wanted to build on a point that Paul had mentioned when he talked about the social dynamics. And I think this is a point that you raised for the continent when you talked about extended family networks, and that maybe women are taking for granted that they will have a village. And this is certainly something that's not, it's a characteristic that is not unique to Africa. As you know, I'm from the Caribbean, and this is very much an island thing also in various islands. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about this in an African context. Are you seeing this extended family network breaking down? And if so, what are some of the factors driving that?
You're not seeing it break down in the countryside. There it's maintained simply because of the very kind of diversified activities that families undertake. In the cities, we see much less of it, and you do see a decline in fertility in the cities that's quite striking. But the rate of urbanization following on urban growth is not what it is in some other parts of the world. Part of the difficulty is that in Africa is coming somewhat late. I mean, Nigeria is an example of a country that has the capacity, based on a domestic petrochemical industry, to build up energy and refining, and is also doing distribution. There's a lot of construction. So those things put people to work. But other African economies are more like India, where they're moving people directly into services. And the formal economy remains small. So a lot of people who come to the city get informal work. They often rotate back into the countryside. They keep their networks open because they can't rely on kind of secure employment to provide for them. All of this tends to maintain and reinforce the kind of ethnic religious identity that can become a problem for social cleavage and social conflict. If you can't rely on the government to keep you safe or give you economic opportunity, you have to rely on your friends and family to provide those things. And there's a very strong commitment still to sharing benefits. If you get a good job, you are expected to share the benefits of that with family members, and they in turn will help you in your way. So even in the cities, a lot of the nature of casual employment, small shops, bring together family units to pursue their economic future. And people still look at a large family as raising their chances for eventual success. You know, if only 1 out of 7 children can go to high school or college, people say, in a simple-minded but indirect way, they say, well, I need to have 5 or 6 kids because the one who succeeds will take care of the rest of us. Right. But I can't count that one will do that. Yeah. So in the cities, it is breaking down. In the cities that have the most formal employment and the most type of kind of manufacturing infrastructure, it's breaking down more. But it's not changing as rapidly as, say, in Asia, where people have been moving into cities where they do a lot of work on assembly, manufacturing, textiles, consumer electronics, toys, all of those things that kind of put people into formal work in factories. It is rough, but it changes the family dynamic. You know, young women who have paid jobs at stable wages can think about their future to a much greater degree. Whereas when you're looking at 3 or 4 people sharing jobs and not knowing if the job will last to the future and having to go back home to help with family needs, you don't get the same transformation in family dynamics that we've seen elsewhere.
Great, thank you. So I think I'd like to open it now. Wow, lots of questions, which is great. This is being webcast live, so I would also say to those of you, I know I've had a few emails from colleagues who are tuning in online. Please also get us your questions online. My colleagues will come to you with a microphone. I'll ask you to give your name and your affiliation, and if you can get to the point of your question as soon as possible, so we get many questions. So it would be wonderful. So, yeah, right here.
Thank you so much. On behalf of everybody, thank you, 3 wonderful scholars, for looking at what looks to me like the African apocalypse. So I have 2 questions. The first is a really basic question that nobody, as far as I know, has grappled with, is why is the demographic transition in Africa so different than the other populations in the world? The second question that I have is, where are the men in all of this? Because in my experience, I'm Adrienne Allison with World Vision, and we have 2 projects in Kenya right now where we've discovered that it's the chiefs and the husbands who make the decisions about desired fertility and achieve fertility. So we're bringing them into our family planning programs. You didn't mention family planning programs anywhere, I noted, but it's more important to get men on board because they control the power. If a girl goes to high school and graduates when she's 20, who is going to want an educated woman like that when the men aren't educated? So it's got to be, they have to do it together. But it's really important, I think, to remember the men.
Great.
Statement, well, the first question is why
Yeah.
is the difference?
For all the men on the, and all the men on the
Where are
panel.
men? There
Yeah.
you go.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Thanks again for a very interesting panel. I'm Alaka Basu at Cornell University and the UN Foundation. My question is, it's a comment and a question. Maybe it's, first of all, to say that Africa is a continent. It's not one country, and we haven't really talked about differences. I mean, Northern Africa, the countries of the Southern Africa are doing much better. Nigeria is overwhelming us. That was a fantastic, fascinating presentation on Nigeria. But Nigeria isn't, the whole of Africa is the optimistic way of thinking about it. So, to ask for the rest of Africa, why is it so different from other parts of the world isn't clear to me. I think John Bongat's work finds, for example, that the fertility decline in most of Africa has begun at earlier levels of development than in many other parts of the world. So that again, at the current time, if one can put in resources, is a hopeful sign that can be exploited. So the result that it doesn't, that economic development doesn't play out in the same way, I don't think has been proven yet. And so maybe we should be thinking further about how things like education, urbanization, etc. might work. And in this context, Jack Goldstone's that big diagram, in particular, there I thought, at one level, I'm saying Africa could very well be like the rest of the world. But there's one way in which it isn't. And so when you talked about using the birth interval changes as a marker of fertility decline, I don't think that's a good marker, because birth intervals in Africa have traditionally been very different, very long for cultural reasons to do with postpartum abstinence and breastfeeding, etc. So modernization, I can't see them getting any bigger than they already are. If anything, they would get smaller as people stop breastfeeding, as people stop reduce postpartum abstinence, etc. So the birth interval measure is probably not the right measure to use. And secondly, I don't think there's any way even uniformly a connection between modernization or fertility decline and increases in birth intervals. India, for example, the bulk of the fertility decline has occurred with birth intervals often shrinking. So people want to hurry up, have the 2 kids and be done with it. So I would stick to fertility or desires or whatever, but birth interval, I wasn't sure why you took that.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have more questions, but Jack is leaning in, so go for it, Jack.
Well, in a sense, the second question provides some of the answer to the first. When you ask, why is Africa different? 2 things about Africa. One, compared to other parts of the world, African families have expressed a desire for larger families. They think 7 to 9, many parts of Africa, again, it's not everywhere, but many parts of Africa, women and men will say they want a very large family. Now, in fact, African cultures have often also had postpartum birth taboos and large spacing intervals. You're quite right when you say birth spacing has been generally longer in Africa and has often come down with modernization, so that birth intervals have become shorter as women have access to formulas as an alternative. Africa was unusual in that we often saw slight increases in fertility in the early stages of modernization, and it was partly because of this. Now, in other parts of the world, women often ended up having more children than they would like because of lack of control of the household situation. And modernization, by offering more economic opportunities to women and forcing the nuclear families to be a little more isolated as they move into the cities, brought the desired family size and actual family size a little closer. In Africa, it's kind of gone the other way. The improvements that allow spacing to be smaller have allowed women to achieve more of the expressed family size. So there are a variety of differences, and it's not uniform across Africa. Rwanda has, for example, been very successful in reducing fertility, but it's somewhat a rare exception still. But I would say the general answer to your question is that in many parts of the world, an ideal family size might have been 4 to 5. Women were having more, they were able to have less, and once that began, it accelerated and they dropped quickly from 4 to 3 to 2. Astonishingly quickly once they fall below 4. There seems, to my mind, to be a virtuous cycle there that once you get below 4 children per family, people start thinking about, we can invest more in each child, we have control over the process, and it seems to go very quickly. On the other hand, in Africa, you have a lot of still desire for large families. There's more capacity, that is, sometimes increases in income and increases in technology allow people to come closer to that high ideal. And there's not a lot working against that right now. Now, it's also very true that a lot of African women either don't have access or has turned away from deliberate family planning. The developed world pushed family planning perhaps excessively as a silver bullet, and we kind of backed away from that, saying, no, you need to let people choose, you need to let women make their own choices, we need to let this happen of its own accord. By and large, that's true. However, if you don't make modern contraception widely available and improve people's knowledge about it and their access to it, then you're also not going to see the results that you'd like.
Jeremy?
I say the only thing I'd add is I do think that desired family size is the key factor here, and you can get into cultural examples. I mean, culturally in East Africa for years, one of the driving forces was that you needed to have 2 boys and 2 girls so that you could name a child after each of the grandparents. That was culturally important. It had all kinds of roots in religion and African religions and other kinds of things. And so if you don't find the ways to move around cultural patterns, and so, I mean, it's an odd comparison, but as we've been dealing with FGM or FGC or other kinds of things, where do you get at the cultural underpinnings and deal with those so that you take away other types of impacts or other types of consequences? So, as long as desired fertility and as long as we push, which is a rightful thing, is to help people both understand their fertility and have access to the ability to be able to control that fertility, as long as that's the effort that we're going to do, then if the desired family size is 4, 5, or 6, then we're going to continue to see families of that size. So anyway, and I will, your men point is very good, and I don't think that this panel we really set up to really deal with types of programs and programmatic outcomes. At least that's, wasn't the layout of kind of the thing. But your point is very well taken on the role and importance of men as partners and understanding their role within this context.
Yeah, as someone who does field work, I'm really uncomfortable when to generalize at African levels when you see so much variation on the slides I showed you on southern Nigeria, northern Nigeria. I mean, the Igbo women are responsible for providing for their own children. It's a major ethno-national group in Nigeria. And in the area I've worked a lot, both in Niger and Nigeria, the resistance to family planning on the part of Muslims needs to be bracketed here. They have a whole narrative of rejecting immunization, for example, to polio, because they fear it will sterilize their girls, right? Literally, the person doing this is a medical doctor leading it. So that needs to be unpacked and the previous errors that were made needs to be focused on. In the case of Muslims, the instability of marriage for women creates an incentive to have children, especially male children, because they need a male in order to intermediate in many situations, especially in a Sharia environment. So a woman is technically a minor, even though she can have a contract and own property. And one of the surveys we've done, the women actually have more economic rights in the north to spend their own money as compared to the south. So it's full of all kinds of unexpected contradictions and expectations there on another project I'm working on. But the status, the breakthrough here is to try to get countries, brought to mind Asia. I've worked in Malaysia that Jack mentioned. There, by girls from the villages, the kampongs, working in factories, that extends the period before they get married. They can make better choices. They're more educated, and the fertility rate in Malaysia is like 2.69, something like that. It's under 3, even though Nigeria, northern Nigeria, and Malaysia are very similar, indirect rule, very common. So that needs to be really, really understood. It's the status of girls in Muslim societies. I want to keep hitting that nail on the head because they have a right to education according to even the most conservative preachers. And the education of girls is what needs to be focused on. Malala
Let's
year
take
here.
some more questions. Lisa?
I'm Lisa Palmer. I'm a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. I have two questions. One has to do with the trends for marriage laws. I think that is the Rwanda case the point that marriage is legal at age 18, and what is the trend across Africa in that? And what do you see as that for the future? And the second question is the long-term impacts of the girls that were kidnapped from the school and terrorized and earlier in the spring. If you could talk on that to see, what are the long-term impacts on that?
Great, thank you. Yes, someone else had their hand. Yes, at the back.
Hi, my name is Teresa Kim, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Maryland School of Public Health and also a delegate through the Women in Public Service Project. My question is specifically for Dr. Goldstone. I was wondering with the data that you're using, if you have any indication of temporal sequence, if you know that increased economic development is causing reduced fertility, or if the reduced fertility is what is causing the stronger economic stability.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi. First of all, thank you for coming and speaking. It's been a pleasure. My name's Kyle Moody. I'm from CFAM. I just had a couple of questions about sort of what, in doing your research, what have you learned from Africa and Africans themselves? I guess more of a kind of a reflective question rather than a hard sort of statistical question of what sort of things in seeing the development of Africa in your collective experiences have you learned about development in general? Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions here on this side? Yes, please.
Hi. Hi, I'm Bill Roaring. I'm with GMU Mason program. My question is basically more of a temporal one. You talked about how things were going to explode by 2050 and then really ratchet up by 2100. And overlaying a lot of this is how the climate will also be going into higher gear over the course of the few decades. And presumably a lot of that will be as the Sahel expands and the Sahara expands and things go from north through south with that. And I'm assuming that a lot of that means that the pastoralists will intrude further south into the agricultural lands, and the agriculturalists will also be moving north to south as well. Could you maybe expand on your comments? I think one of you alluded to migration patterns at one point in your discussion.
Okay, thank you. Any other final questions? Okay, so we have a few questions on marriage laws, the long-term impact of the girls that were kidnapped. Jack, specifically for you, temporal sequence, economic development, and reduced fertility over time. Overall, what have you learned from engaging Africans? What was their perceptions and their perspective on development overall and on the continent? And then what about migration and sort of movement over time, maybe climate-induced movement, and how is that tied perhaps to pastoralists? So, Jeff, take your pick.
I'll take a couple. I think that there is a lot of policy work going on around marriage laws and trying to increase age at marriage. It depends on what country you're in. It depends on a whole host of factors as to what are the rationale, how willing policymakers are to deal with that and where that's going. I think it is recognized that, again, as we look at fertility and you get the 4 twos, too early, too often, too late, and too soon. Too many, thank you. Sorry, too soon, too early. you know, that all of this talk about whether it is increasing women's education, whether it is employment and other kinds of things, anything that delays both the onset of sexual activity and the onset of that first birth, and one of the best predictors of that is time of marriage. You still have many, many very traditional societies, and the amount of birth within wedlock is still what is the driving factor. So pushing back that age of marriage for all of the reasons that we would all agree with. So I think there's a lot of activity. How productive it's going to be, I mean, I can't offer right now because I'm not quite sure who all is doing the push. And the only comment that just in terms of working with Africans, I had the privilege of working, I think, in 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa over the course of my career. And, to an earlier comment, Africa is a continent, it's not a country. But I'd even offer that Africa is not a series of countries. If you go back to the 1884 Berlin Convention that created the lines that make modern Africa, with a few exceptions, with a few wars that have changed things since then, the lines were created by Western leaders in Northern Europe, have nothing to do with cultural patterns, have nothing to do with language groupings, have nothing to do with anything else. And so just like you can't say that any one American is representative of all American or any one part of the country is, you can't say that either within what's going on. I found my colleagues and my partners throughout Africa to be dedicated, well-meaning, wanting the best for their families, wanting the best for their countries, the amazing ability of people, if they chose to out-migrate for better opportunity, and they're having not done that, but having stayed to see to further development has been astounding. So I have nothing but, wonderful things to say about, both the collegiality and the way, and as long as the rest of us who in any situation come in with respect and with, an attempt to understand, culture and law and all the other elements of what's going on, we're tremendously blessed and lucky to be able to do the work that we do.
Paul?
Yeah, just briefly on the the marriage laws in the Rwandan case, that's an authoritarian state, and if you have this dilemma, the developmental state in Asia are authoritarian states without human rights, and they imprisoned in all opposition. So that's the dilemma of liberalism, economic and political. In a democracy like Senegal or Mali or Nigeria, if you put personal status laws in front of the Muslim population, they vote them all down because they believe in the right to marry at any age and girls and things like this. So at the heart of the problem bringing in Chibok and the girls is that the about 23% of men acknowledge in the demographic and health surveys, Muslim men in the north, men in these predominantly Muslim, that they have at least one other wife. So that's a significant number of the total number of women, and there's the sex ratios in the north are men, there are more men than women, so that's already shows the bias against girls and health and access to health care. So that the problem is for youths is to be able to accumulate wealth enough to pay bride price while competing with wealthy men that can marry 2, 3, and 4 wives. Right? And so many parts of the Muslim world, the polygamy issue is not an issue, but in Africa it's a major issue, and it produces the shortage of opportunities for men, young men, to be able to marry. And that is also what's driving Boko Haram to capture girls and then allocate them to their fighters in the area. This is essentially the reinvention of 19th century slavery, according to Nigerian colleagues of mine, and I agree. The problem with controlling them is that they've moved into this forest on the Cameroon border near a mountain range, and now they're situated between 3 countries, Niger, Cameroon, 4 countries, Chad and Nigeria. And the girls, when they escape, provide information that they move at night, and they're very difficult. They've broken up into small groups, and they're very aware of it. And it's the same thing ISIS is doing in Iraq and Syria. So it's no problem. The other thing on the pastoralists, the problem among the pastoralists is they look at these animals as 4-legged banks. All right, so you have to provide an alternative credit system to get them to not keep the animal till it's 7 or 8 years old and consumes trees and fodder for 7 or 8 years in case there's a risk. People invest in these animals, sedentary agriculturalists and others. So if you had a microcredit system that would provide access to credit, they would sell the animal at the optimum moment, and in Nigeria they can do very well. So the price of meat has gone up 8% a year, controlling for inflation in southern Nigeria, where the tsetse fly eliminates the possibility of animals. So if that were organized in a market way with credit backing up smallholders, it would be a solution. And the pastoralists are pushing from the desert and are pushing closer into the agricultural area that's where more and more cultivation is occurring, less fallow land.
Several things. Where are the men, you asked? And to get back to this issue, in many cases, the men are actively preserving very patriarchal social regimes. When I was last in Africa, I read in a local paper a confession of a female activist who had attended a lot of global family planning meetings, and she said, you know, when I talk to my sisters overseas, we talk about the importance of controlling our families. But when we get back to our countries in Africa, we are so few in number, and it is so intimidating to go up against the massive power structures of the male establishment that we are sometimes timid. The reality of women's rights throughout history is that they have not been willingly granted by men. Women have had to fight for the vote, for the right for education, for the right to equality in careers. When we were in Japan, we found ourselves in a country where women have a very high level of education and a very high level of industrial and civil discourse. It's a wonderful society in many ways, but it's not as wonderful for women as it is for men. Although men have the burden of being round-the-clock salarymen and giving their lives to their company, women are expected to stay home with children, and although some women are permitted to stay on the workforce, it's a choice. If they take time off to start a family, they get off the track, they're not taken seriously, they can't get back on. So you have a few women parliamentarians, a few women executives, but it's much smaller than any other advanced countries. And that's a cultural thing that's very ingrained, and women have to fight to change that. In some countries, Muslim countries like Tunisia, like Senegal, you've had governments that have chosen to invest in women's opportunities for education. And the one reason the Tunisian Arab uprising has been more successful than others in preventing a sharp polarization between Islamist and un-Islamist factions is women have been in the lead in the judiciary, in civil society, in the legal profession. Women have fought to prevent a strict Sharia imposition in the law, and they've been successful because years of civil society and opportunities for women have meant there are a lot of women in the professions, in organizations, in unions. So they have a voice and they're using it. Where you don't have that, it's much more difficult, which is why we all think secondary education for women is so crucial for so many reasons. Now, the extreme example of this is what's going on with ISIS in the Middle East. You talk about the kidnappings of women. ISIS has not only proudly said that we enslave women and abuse them, they claim they have a right to do that. And one of my friends said to me, well, why doesn't ISIS just collapse after that? Doesn't every man who has a daughter or a wife run away from that in horror? Would that it were so, but it is not the case. A lot of men find the subjugation of women to be something that works for them. Even in many parts of the world where you can say, look, women who are having 6, 7, 8 births run a very high risk still of death in childbirth. You may lose your wife. You have a much better chance of keeping her if you agree to have fewer children. a lot of men don't find that a persuasive argument. They say, I need children. I can always get another wife. It's a tragedy, but I'm not going to change my family aspiration for that. So these are really strong barriers to change. And again, the best way to get that change seems to be to give women the opportunity to fight their own battles for that, because they're the only ones that can win it.
Great. Okay. I think it's time is upon us, but I think you can touch base with the speakers afterwards. I think we've, in the discussion and in the question and answer session, we've covered some of the additional components that we didn't hear in the talk. So I think that was really good. We will be continuing to develop these themes in 2 sessions that we will have next week. Next week, Wednesday, we will have a conversation between Tom Lovejoy and Jonathan Foley. And I know many of you know Jonathan Foley's work looking at demographics and food security. He is now the new executive director of the California Academy of Sciences. And he's going to be focusing on connections between demographics, food security, climate awareness, and sustainability. So that conversation is happening next Wednesday, the 22nd, from 3 to 5. And on next Thursday, the 23rd, we're actually going to follow up with some of the themes that we discussed today on population projections and education. We have an event called World Population and Human Capital in the 21st Century, which we're organizing with our colleagues from IASA, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. Wolfgang Lutz, who many of us know, well-established demographer, will be joined by Bill Butts, formerly of PRB, most recently with IASA, Scott Ratloff, and Jason Bremner from PRB. And we'll have a discussion looking at world population and human capital. So 2 important discussions that are occurring next week that build on the topics that we've covered today. Thank you. And Jeff?
One last thing. I didn't answer your question on development, but there is an event tomorrow here at the Wilson Center on the OECD Global Development Report, and approaches at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon.
All these great events. So please join me in thanking our panelists. We had a really good discussion today. And please continue to have a look at our work and materials online. This discussion today will be recorded. It has been recorded, but will be captured on the website, as will a summary of today's discussion. So thank you very much.
I am really angry. I won't be
Where are you based in Washington? Yes.
Oh, man.
I've used your stuff.
Yeah, you don't know Wolfgang? He's great. But you haven't seen. Oh, you've
Online,
not
it's
met
great.
him.
If I wanna look for something.
I know, we do.